Okay guys, we will start the second half of the exciting session now. You all know George and you have his bio, but I will read the significant portions. What does it mean to be CEO of a movement? For George Rotter, it meant dropping out of the master's program and running up a $30,000 credit card debt to fund the launch of Engineers Without Borders Canada. That turned out to be a good decision. George is now the sole CEO of an organization with volunteers and staff that have been embedded in more than 150 African businesses. They drive EWB's change ventures, working to help local leaders and entrepreneurs to create bottom-up disruptive innovations that address systemic causes of poverty. Through EWB, George inspires an ever-growing network of change leaders who are dedicated to making disruptive, positive changes. He was awarded the Young Leaders Award by the Public Policy Forum as one of the Canada's top 40 under 40 and awarded the prestigious Action Canada Fellowship on Public Policy. He was also recognized by Time magazine as one of Canada's next generation of social leaders. George holds a Bachelor of Applied Science from University of Waterloo, a Bachelor of Applied Science from Seneca College, and a Doctorate of Applied Science honorary from Queen's University. And he still doesn't have a master's degree. We are very privileged to have George among us, and I will not stand between you and him. Please help me welcome George.
Awesome. So, thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here. I love talking to a room of entrepreneurs whenever I can, or people who are interested in entrepreneurship, mainly because that's the essence of Engineers Without Borders, and also I can show up in a pair of jeans on Bay Street and nobody sort of says anything really. It's really fun to talk about also EWB and some of the work that we're doing. We're an organization who thinks about entrepreneurship in potentially a very similar way to many of you in this room, but also thinks about entrepreneurship in some ways a bit of a different way. And that's part of what I want to talk about tonight, and part of how I want to talk about what we do is really thinking about how entrepreneurship can create systemic innovations or systemic changes in our society that will add a tremendous amount of social value and that will address justice issues both in Canada and in sub-Saharan Africa. And I want to start by kind of trying to challenge as much as I possibly can also your notions of what it means to be in sub-Saharan Africa and work in sub-Saharan Africa. And so this is Africa, obviously. And let me take you in to tell you a little bit about a country called Malawi, which, as you can see, is down here in southwestern or southeastern Africa. It's a small little sliver of a country. You can see that it's landlocked other than this lake that is sitting here in the middle. It's a country of roughly about 13 million people. It is fairly densely populated, and it's extremely poor by a lot of the various measures that you can look at to judge the wealth of a country. If you look at GDP, if you look at things like child mortality and infant mortality, it has it is quite low down the list on the Human Development Index. And it's almost in some ways classic when you think about a place that is in sub-Saharan Africa. When you think about a country in sub-Saharan Africa, Malawi is almost probably what picture comes to your mind. And if I got you guys to kind of sit in your tables and brainstorm, all right, tell me and draw a picture of rural sub-Saharan Africa before I started talking, and describe that picture, and describe a picture of somebody who's a farmer in rural Malawi, which is one of the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa, you might have drawn something like this. You might have drawn a picture of someone like Edward here, who's wearing a pair of flip-flops, and we just told a funny story about repairing these. I'm sure these have been repaired a number of times. Who's in kind of ragged clothes. He looks all sorts of poor. He's kind of sitting there, almost just waiting for a handout. And this is kind of what we think of when we think of sub-Saharan Africa, at least in North America oftentimes. And it's what we think of when we think of work that Engineers Without Borders might do, when we think of charitable work, when we think of creating value, when we think of issues of justice. It's how do we help people like Edward? I want to turn this on its head a little bit, because that's actually Edward. Edward posed for the other picture. He put on his farming clothes, and he's like, yeah, look poor. And the guy taking the picture is like, no, poorer. You don't look poor enough, Edward. And the thing is, if you look at the statistics, Edward is, by every definition that's out there, he's poor. He lives under $2 a day. He's a farmer in rural Malawi. He's in a community that's really far from a road, has cell phone access. But this is kind of what Edward is. This is what he looks like. He's a trader. He has church clothes. He wears not just these church clothes, but he wears colored shirts every day to do his work. And he's trying to make a better life for his family. And he has a cell phone. And he's driven and he's dignified and he has an enormous amount of potential, except he's living within a system that constrains that potential in very substantial ways that are sometimes difficult for him to control and that oftentimes require innovations locally to be able to overcome. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I want to talk to you about how we can have the real Edward Kabuzela stand up. Just stand up. Just stand up. Because these are the people, these are the individuals who are driving development and are driving poverty reduction and are driving the overcoming of justice in sub-Saharan Africa. And the story of Engineers Without Borders is really a story of figuring out how do we actually support these individuals? How do we support them in accelerating curves like this, which is an under 5 mortality graph for Zambia, so the number of kids who die before the age of 5, which you can see over the past 20 years has had a precipitous decline. It's still 100 times higher, almost 100 times higher than you would see in Canada. But it's on the downward slope, and it's on the downward slope because of people like Edward. At the same time, you have other things happening in a place like Zambia, where people like Edward, who are in rural areas and who are farming, are certainly improving their crop and are able to improve their lives. But while at one point they're actually having this massive reduction in under 5 mortality, what you can see here is actually 2 different graphs. One is the average yield of maize, which is the sort of #1 crop in Zambia. Any of you been to Zambia in this room? Okay. So everybody in Zambia eats maize, every single meal. It's called nshima. There's a saying in the country, if you haven't eaten nshima, you have not eaten. And I've actually tested this in Zambia. I tried to have a meal without nshima, and I was not allowed to have a meal without nshima. This is simply not a meal. And so everybody in the country grows this crop, and you can see that yields have been steadily increasing on average. The interesting thing, when you disaggregate some of the data, and they've done this for the past 5 years, it's actually really only the top 10% of farmers within the country of Zambia who are driving increases in the yields. And while people like Edward's lives are improving, and he's driving that improvement in under 5 mortality, what's also happening is that there are things that are preventing him from improving his life more substantially, and things like improving the yield that he's getting from his crops. And I want to talk a little bit about what those are and what that looks like. This is another graph that I think also talks about and sort of speaks to these systemic challenges. And what this is in Zambia, these are percentages of a population with access to either water or improved water or improved sanitation. So the water is in red and the sanitation is in blue. Again, what you can see, and probably one of the things that's led to really strong reductions in under 5 mortality, is people are getting water. It's really crucial. You don't get sick if you have clean water, or you get sick much less. Unfortunately, you still get sick if you don't have access to improved sanitation, because you have vectors of diseases that are able to spread really effectively. And unfortunately, in Zambia, while people have been able to get access to clean water, on a very regular basis, they still don't have access to sanitation. So there's a really kind of interesting and complex dynamic that's happening in Edward's life and in people like, for people like him in rural sub-Saharan Africa. And I want to talk a little bit about that. And I want to talk a little bit generally about what's happening broadly in Africa, just for 2 seconds, because there's sort of a context here that EWB is working in that might be interesting and might be new to you in this room. So in addition to all these kind of realities that Edward is seeing on the ground, these graphs behind it, which show kind of progress but systemic challenges that are really still undermining his life, you have these macro trends happening. You have improved democracy and governance, and if I showed this graph is from 2011. There's a great contrast, and I forgot to put it in the presentation, from 1999. And basically the number of countries in pure red, which indicates that a country is not a democracy and has very weak governance, is basically the entire map. As compared to now, or in 2011, what you can see is lots of patches of green, where you have countries that have effectively become full democracies. Take a country like Ghana, which just this past year had an election where the ruling party, or the now ruling party, took over from the previously ruling party by a 0.5% margin. And there was no unrest. There was no, the outgoing president didn't say, hey, let's start a riot. Just said, yeah, we lost. Took it to court, actually. But once the court case came down, there was a concession of the government. And that was sort of the third time that's happened in Ghana. And there's this really incredible wave of democracy in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a story that really hasn't hit North America, but it's an important macro trend going on. Second is technology. You go around Kenya, and I imagine that many of you have been to Kenya.
How do you define flawed democracy?
Pardon me?
How do you define flawed democracy?
Flawed democracy.
The number 2 legend was a flawed democracy.
Yeah. So this is from Transparency International, and was a study that was done by The Economist. And effectively, a flawed democracy is one where there might be voting irregularities, or there might be some level of corruption at the polls, or it might be probably something like what goes on in the United States, or something along those lines. But yeah, it's sort of on the way to a really robust multi-party democracy where you have people who feel as though they have the freedom to vote. You have an independent judiciary. You have a legislature that is roughly representing people around the country. The second trend that's really interesting, and it connects in some ways with democracy, is technology. Many of you have been to Kenya these days? Okay, so lots of people in this room have been to Kenya. Kenya and many parts of sub-Saharan Africa have really high penetration of mobile phones. In Kenya, one of the things that this has resulted in is this incredible mobile payments platform that has resulted, which is a great story of entrepreneurship that I won't tell right now, but if you're interested in, I'd be happy to let you know, which is a payments platform called M-Pesa. And M-Pesa basically allows you on your phone by text message through agents around the country to both load money onto your phone, to get money from that agent, and to send money to somebody else through your M-Pesa account. To give you a sense, 40% of the GDP of Kenya will pass through M-Pesa this year. 40% of the GDP of the entire country will pass through M-Pesa. I landed in Nairobi about a year ago, got out of the airport, got into the cab. The cab driver said, oh, by the way, I don't take cash. I only take M-Pesa. And I'm like, what do you mean? I don't, I just got here. He's like, oh, it's okay. I'll take you to my cousin down the road. He'll sign you up and he'll get you a SIM card. And sure enough, we drove a little bit, went to his cousin, got a SIM card, loaded up my phone, and now I have M-Pesa. And I didn't touch a Kenyan shilling my entire time that I was in the country. I just paid by M-Pesa. And what it allows is really incredible things. So about a year ago, launched M-Shwari, which is by the company that launched M-Pesa, which is effectively a bank. And this bank, which was going to do loans and was going to do savings accounts and was going to do all these things using M-Pesa and provide interest and take interest on these loans, in the first 30 days was able to sign up 150,000 people as new bank account holders in the country who had never had a bank account in their life before in the first 30 days of launching M-Shwari. Since then, 12 months later, they have nearly 3 million customers out of a country of 40 million people. So they have achieved in 12 months nearly 10% market penetration for a bank of people who've never had a bank before. This is all enabled by technology, and it's doing some really incredible things. This is Copa, which is also built on the M-Pesa platform. It's a small startup. Actually, it ends up being populated by a bunch of people who are past EWBers. And what it is exactly what it looks like. It's a leasing mechanism for solar lights. So basically, you have a solar panel that sits on the roof, 3 lights, a cell phone charger, and the way that it works is you pay a little bit of money up front to get the whole unit, but it doesn't pay for the whole unit. Every single day, you need to send it money by your cell phone to turn the lights on. And then after 10 months, you own it. And what it does is the every single day payment is about the average of what every person in the country pays per day for kerosene. Anyway. And so it's effectively found a model to pay for this technology using mobile phones that replaces an outdated technology. So technology is completely transforming sub-Saharan Africa. And then the last thing is you're having this, this enormous number of people moving from about $1.25 to $2 to $3 to $4 to $5 to $6 a day. And you're roughly going to have in the next 10 or 15 years about 250 million people joining that middle class, where now what they have is they have purchasing power, they have, and in many ways, more importantly than purchasing power, they have choices. They have choices of what they want to do with their lives. They have the ability to think about sending their kids to school and university. They have the ability to think about doing something other than what their parents did, which was probably subsistence farming. And this is transformative. So there's these macro trends happening in sub-Saharan Africa, while at the same time you still have these systemic challenges that affect somebody like Edward. And what we see with Engineers Without Borders and what we focus on is not innovations that are natural market innovations, not ones that are going to address a described and easily describable market need, but innovations that we think will be able to disrupt the way that things are done, that are actually going to either disrupt existing markets or fill a market void that is not being filled by the current players because there are systemic challenges. And those might be businesses, and those might be social innovations. It doesn't really matter. What we want to be able to do is disrupt the systems at play such that we're able to tackle poverty and fight injustice and the injustice of people not having choice in a rural area. And effectively, the way that we frame this is the difference between cause and effect problems, which we think require incremental innovations. So something like vaccination. Vaccination in rural sub-Saharan Africa is a hard problem to solve. You need to figure out how to get centralized purchasing at a low enough price. You need to be able to distribute that to rural health centers in a way that the vaccine is refrigerated. You need to have decent training for the people who are actually delivering those vaccines. You need to be able to get kids to the actual rural health stations and put a needle in their arm. The needle needs to be clean. You need to suppress the needle, put the right amount of vaccine. But the interesting thing about it, something like vaccination, is it is actually a cause and effect problem. Once you press that plunger and put that vaccine in the kid's arm, you're done. You've actually achieved the impact. And so it's a complicated chain of events, but it's actually a very solvable problem. Lots of opportunity for incremental innovation, less need for disruptive innovation. Instead, you look at something like sanitation, and what we see is a wicked problem. Something like rural sanitation happens through building latrines like this. People can build them on their own. It's pretty easy. Ventilated pit latrines. The challenge is they collapse. If they're built like this, they collapse every 3-4 years because of the rain. So you need to rebuild them. So it's not just kind of teaching people to build a latrine or building it for them. Definitely can't build it for them because it'll collapse and then you need to come rebuild it. And that's not efficient. It's not just teaching them to build it once. It's figuring out how do you actually engage in a long-term behavior change activity such that people in these areas start to fundamentally have a better understanding of germ theory. They start to have a better understanding of health and how health works. And then they start to link that to the behavior of working their ass off every 2 to 3 years to dig a shithole so that they can make sure to keep their families safe and healthy. That's actually a very hard problem to solve. And then you need institutions to be able to support that over a long period of time. And only if you do that for 15 years in a row are you actually going to see a major reduction in disease transmission, because that's the only way to actually break some of the cycles that you'll see with these vectors of disease. That's the type of thing that we see as a wicked problem that requires systemic innovations and disruptive innovations. I want to tell you about some of these innovations at a more tangible level. And I want to tell you about it a little bit through the eyes of this woman here, Margaret Mwembele, I believe, who lives in Kitete, Zambia, which is in the eastern part of Zambia. And I saw Margaret about a 1.5 years ago. I came up to her. I was on the back of a motorcycle with one of our Zambian colleagues. Got off the motorcycle, came up to Margaret, put out my hand with this big smile. She grabbed my hand, shook it, and said, "Hi, my name is Margaret, and I have the best buns in Kitete." And I said, "That's great. You've got also a fantastic sense of humor." And of course, she was referring to the buns that are behind her, not behind her, but in the back of this photo. And what she's showing there is, in fact, she's showing off her product. She's an entrepreneur. She's a baker. She's selling these buns. And the reason that I was visiting her is because I was getting a sense of what are the challenges that somebody like this, who's an entrepreneur in rural Zambia, what are the challenges that she faces as she tries to build a business, as she tries to deliver a value proposition to customers in Kitete. And what she told me really was a story of a few years ago, her idea of starting this business of baking buns, because she'd made this great bread and her friends would come over and eat it, and then she started saying, well, maybe I could sell this. So she built this really big wood-fired oven in the backyard, and she started to make these buns there and started to sell them here and there, and then realized she couldn't really get much of a throughput on this wood-fired oven, and the wood was really expensive and difficult to find, so was charcoal, and was really inconsistent in heat. So she decided, okay, I'm going to see if I can make an electric oven or get an electric oven made. So this is what came out, which is scary. For those of you who are engineering and geeky, it is a handmade electric oven. Basically what that means is inside there is very high gauge wire that has been stripped down, and they found a way to put really high amperage current through it that makes the wire glow red and heat up and then heat the bread. The voltage in Zambia famously fluctuates, so the heat in the oven fluctuates with the voltage on the grid, and so you have to be a very good baker to not burn your buns. But she was doing this and she was driven. She's like, I absolutely want to grow my business. And she has 2 sons, and she wants to get her sons to university. And this was the way that she was going to do it. But she couldn't go beyond this. She was not able to, through this electric oven, she was not able to generate enough free cash flow with this business to be able to finance and buy a proper electric oven, which would have cost her about $1,600 Canadian dollars, the equivalent of that. And the reason is because there's this massive gap in financing in most of rural sub-Saharan Africa, and certainly in rural Zambia, that entrepreneurs who want to invest in a capital piece of equipment against an entrepreneurial business And if that capital piece of equipment is anything over $600 where microfinance leaves off, and anything under $50,000, the only option they have available to them are loan sharks who charge probably 250 to 300% interest, which you can never afford if you're not making that kind of margin off of funds. And so there's this huge gap. There's this huge financing gap, and the gap exists for a real reason, because nobody has been smart enough, nobody has been determined enough to figure out how do you deal with the fact that someone like Margaret has no finance record, she has no credit history, she has very few assets to her name that she could call collateral, and a $1,500 loan, $1,600 loan is a lot of money if you are in rural Zambia. And so what happened is that one of EWB's volunteers and eventually our entrepreneurs teamed up with a Zambian entrepreneur, Mark and Chico, and they started this social enterprise called Rent to Own. And what EWB did was help them with the initial seed funding and a lot of support as it grew from this early idea to now this really robust business. And what it's able to do is it's able to deliver really great electric ovens like this that I saw when I was there about a year and a half ago that Margaret showed me, which is kind of fancy, and has allowed her to increase her business right away over a period of, and she was not even finished paying this off. So payment terms are generally 10 months. She puts 10% down, and there's an agent model that's able to actually verify these entrepreneurs and take in their information and be able to then approve these rent-to-own loans and leases, equipment leases. And in the first 6 months, because she still had 4 months to go on this, she was able to increase her overall revenue 70%. She hired 2 bakers, opened a retail outlet, hired 1 person to run that retail outlet, and was saying, all right, I'm 4 months away from paying off this oven, and what's coming next is I'm going to rent a mixer. And she's like, I tell you, Jordan, I'm going to rent a mixer. So actually, about a month ago, I sent an email to Rent to Own and Mark, and I'm like, hey, how's Margaret doing? And he's like, she got a mixer. Let me show you. So she got a mixer. And she did this. And what that's allowed her to do is increase her business another 30%, because she's able to have more outputs and more efficiency. And the next thing she wants to do is get a double-decker oven, so that she's able to get her outputs and efficiency and grow this business even more. And what this has done is it's allowed, what Rent to Own has done is it's allowed a whole set of people who probably had these amazing ideas in rural Zambia and could not get the capital to be able to deliver because there was not a creative business model that unlocked this. There wasn't a way to unlock this. And what Rent to Own did is they built this business model at the very, very granular level. And to give you a sense, like, this is in some ways kind of low-tech meet high-tech and really meeting a market need, but doing it in a very disruptive way. This is their dashboard, their Salesforce dashboard. The data for their Salesforce dashboard comes from Android phones that their agents around the country carry around. And when they go and they visit these entrepreneurs, or prospective entrepreneurs, they actually do the surveys directly into their Android phones, press go, and it goes right into Salesforce. And there's an algorithm that actually does the assessment of the entrepreneurs in Salesforce automatically, and then they call the agents and they say approved or not approved. All the payments go through mobile phone, and so they show up in Salesforce right away and are aggregated there. It's one of the values that Engineers Without Borders kind of high-level geekiness adds in these businesses is giving them the kind of process, operational rigor to be able to scale this thing so that this year, to give you a sense, it's going to reach probably about 500 clients, so about $750,000 of top-line revenue in Zambia, which is, and it's an autonomous organization now that's out there, that's spun off of EWB, and in fact, probably in a couple of years will be much larger than Engineers Without Borders. And what it's done is it's disrupted how people see financing of rural entrepreneurs in Africa and creates this disruptive change, we hope. Obviously, there's not 100% success rate. We hope that that lasts about 3 to 5 years. And what we really see with Engineers Without Borders as one of our core value adds that we're able to add, that we're able to deliver to this, is this incredible network of really smart, totally motivated people around the country who are involved in building their leadership capabilities. And many of them are engineers who are coming to systemic change and social issues for the first time, and really learning about these issues through Engineers Without Borders. So to give you a sense, we have 40,000 people on our mailing list, about 6,000 active volunteers, about 1,000 leaders per year going through various different programs, volunteering between 5 and in some cases a ridiculous amount of 40 hours a week. Really learning what it's like to go out there and in Canada, this is not even in Africa, but in Canada, work on social justice issues and try and figure out how they can lead groups. So to give you an example, we just had our student chapter presidents in town last weekend, and I was sitting down with the Queen's co-chapter presidents, who are both 21 years old, and they were telling me about their chapter and the fact that they have 48 people with job descriptions this year. They have an executive team of 12, and each of those executive team members has 3 to 4 direct reports, and all of that is reporting into them at 21 years of age. And I was thinking to myself, that is big time. I would not have been able to do that at 21. But what they're able to do is they're able to go out and actually work on important issues that are happening locally. So they're working on changing their university's purchasing policies to things like fair trade coffee and jewelry, to looking at government policies and working at advocacy and government advocacy, to looking at engineering curriculum and saying, how can we change this so that it's more globally relevant for the next 20 years instead of stuck in the 20th century. So all of these things to really bring activism to a local level, while at the same time building these incredible skills to think about systems and to build their leadership. And we call this creating sort of an ecosystem for systems change leadership, and really understanding what it is to produce people who can look at ideas and see ways to disrupt systems to create much more justice in the world. And so for us, a lot of this is kind of taking your classic engineer who has a lot of intellectual curiosity and adding a bit of human curiosity to that, or more than a bit of human curiosity, which we see as critical. We see it as building in and building on the typical, I would say, predisposition of engineers to iterate and experiment, but giving them a platform to do so. With EWB, and one of the ways that we do this is to create a culture where innovating is absolutely permitted, and in fact, that failure is necessary on the way to success, and we invite this. So every year we actually publish a failure report for the organization, and people compete to get the best failure in the organization and see if they can get into the failure report. And what it does is it creates a culture where failure is safe, and where failure leads to success, and where it leads to innovation. And then the third thing is we help people really understand how do you think rather than in linear ways, but think in systems. So we do things like this, system mapping, which this is a group in Malawi who's mapping out the water and sanitation system there, literally plotting out different actors, understanding the resource flows between them, understanding how information flows, and then asking the question, if I wanted to intervene to create a disruptive innovation, where would I spend my time that is going to have the biggest and best leverage point to create disruptive change in the system? So those are the skills that we bring, and it's this incredible talent pool that we're able to bring to create these innovations. And this is sort of a typical model that many of you would have seen, which is a typical startup model from startup to validation to preparation to growth. And EWB really operates everything from the kind of sparking idea stage all the way through to preparation and just before growth, preparing people to grow, preparing them to scale, which we think for us doesn't take 6 months, which is a typical accelerator program, but actually takes between 3 and 5 years. And one of the things that we do and that we provide a lot of value in is it's not just for business ideas, but it's for ideas that we think can address systemic issues. And focusing on those systemic issues is difficult, and it takes time, and it's something that requires patience, but it also requires an enormous amount of determination, which all of you know as people who are interested in entrepreneurship. let me mostly end there, actually, instead of showing you these various different other things. But I'll just sort of mention a couple of other things really, really quick. I've talked a lot about kind of business innovation, and rent-to-own is a good example of business innovation. The impression, I don't want you to get the impression that EWB is an organization that accelerates social businesses. We also work on social problems from a nonprofit perspective as well. And so one example would be some of our work in Malawi on developing innovations that can operate within government. So how do you get a bureaucracy in Malawi that's supposed to be providing adequate water and sanitation and supporting that at a rural level, but that has not enough money, not enough people, not enough resources, and all sorts of outside forces acting on them, telling them to do the wrong things with a lot of money that they have to listen to. How do you get that system innovating? How do you get that system effectively supporting scaling up water and sanitation for the entire country? And so one way we think about it, rather than kind of your typical picture, which is what an NGO would probably show you if they were talking about a water and sanitation project, some kid with a water pump and splashing water and looking really cute and cuddly. This is our version of the cute and cuddly kid splashing water on her face, which is effectively the system map of Malawi. What you can see there is there's information, there's resources, and then there's accountability. There's a variety of different organizations and actors there, and what they're doing there is identifying where the points in the system are to intervene, and where the failure points are in the system to intervene. And then what we have done in our innovations on the ground have determined what are the different types of things, what are the actions, what are the products that we can create, and work with Malawians to create at a local level that will drive innovation within government. And what it's ended up being is a lot of fairly simple technologies, but a lot of really important different business processes. So this is an example. This guy's name is Noel. He's totally kick-ass. He's one of the biggest data geeks I've ever met in my entire life, and I've met a lot of data geeks. He is working in Salima, which is in rural Malawi, and he is a water officer. And his job is really to figure out how do you get it so that every community in Salima has access to water and has access to sanitation, and more importantly is something called open defecation free. And that is the goal of Malawi, and that's what Noel is working toward. And what we worked with him to do is to figure out within this really tricky system in Malawi of government, how do you innovate? And he's a big data geek, and he said, data is how we're going to innovate, because data is power. And if I can have the best data, then I can have more power. And if I have more power, then better decisions are made because they're going to be made at a more local level as compared to being made by the national level of government or by some dude in Washington in the World Bank who's going to be writing a big check. And so he used data, and he built this extremely sophisticated spreadsheet that gathers this data, and these business processes to be able to gather data from health officers to get better quality data than anybody else had in the country into this spreadsheet, to be able to prove to people that they could actually do better planning on where water pumps are, which ones are working, which ones are not, so that they could direct resources more effectively. And this is now scaled to, and this is our take on what we sponsor. This is how we actually make things sexy. Data isn't naturally sexy unless you're an engineer, so we try our best. So somebody like Noel is out there and he's innovating and he's really changing within government to try and work for justice, and he's found this way to kind of create disruptions that goes beyond kind of your typical way to address poverty to actually say, okay, this is a systemic issue, and this is an innovation that's going to address issues at a systemic level. I won't show these because these are a bit too much. But really, the message that I'll leave you with, because we're getting a bit late, is with EWB, and when you think of sub-Saharan Africa, I want you to think of people like Noel, who are innovating within government. And I want you to think of an organization like Engineers Without Borders or any other out there that you're interested in supporting, of saying, how do you get people like Noel, how do you support people like Noel to be able to drive their own ideas and to drive justice within their own countries? How do you support people like Margaret, who are doing the exact same thing in a slightly different way by building businesses that are growing economic wealth and are proving models that are challenging people's notion that a woman in rural Zambia is creditworthy, which of course she is, and the fact that the system thinks that she isn't is total bullshit. And what this is doing is it's disproving that fact that she is not creditworthy, and it's completely disrupting these systems. And then how do you go back and sort of challenge your ideas that someone like Edward is in fact not sitting there waiting for a handout, poor, and is in fact driving development within his own country at a local level, and how do we address the systemic issues that are going to allow him to do so in a really powerful way? And so it's people like Noel, and it's people like Margaret, and people like Edward who are driving development in sub-Saharan Africa. And what we see our job with Engineers Without Borders is to figure out ways to come up with innovations that will, along with them, that will help take down some of these systemic barriers that will allow them to be successful at doing so, which, frankly, they're going to do with or without us. And we just hope that we can actually accelerate that a little bit more quickly. So that is EWB and systemic innovation in as short as I can do. Thanks for having me.
Any questions?
So how do you measure yourselves? So how much good have I done, or?
So it's actually it's tricky in our case. And the reason that it's tricky because we have 16 different ventures that we incubate, plus we have our advocacy work in Canada that's working on policy, and our various different institutional change work. And so the diversity of stuff that we have going on is considerable. So each of the various different areas of EWB has their own bottom line. So on something like our incubator, it's each of the various different ventures actually have their own KPIs, just like you would have in a business. So in something like rent to own, what they're doing is they're tracking repayment rates, and then they're tracking certain number of customers that they're able to sign up, and the turnover in the capital and whether or not that's healthy. So those are their KPIs that they have on the next stage to the business. Something like our Malawi Water and Sanitation Program, it's actually a little bit trickier because they're not putting in place infrastructure. What they're doing is they're coming up with innovations. And so what they've developed is a series of indicators that suggest the innovations that they have are being taken up by higher levels of government, and they are being able to be scaled throughout the country. So for example, one of the things that they've done, which is really clever, is in working with their Malawian counterparts, they give each of the things that they do a unique name that wouldn't be used anywhere else within the country. So in this case, it was the DSS, the Decision Support System. So what they then do is they look at various reports and various meetings that don't have EWB people in it or don't have somebody like Noel in it, and they ask themselves, how many times is DSS referred to as an indicator that that idea is getting traction within the country so that it can achieve institutional scale. And then they're saying, not only is it Noel, but is it, like, let's start to trace how many times removed from Noel. So if it's Noel's boss who's saying it, that's worth a particular value of impact. And if it's Noel's boss who talked to somebody else who said it independently in another meeting, that's worth a higher value because it represents a broader level of scale. And so it's trickier, like it's not like dollars at the end of the day, profit margin. But what they're doing is they're saying, okay, what are those indicators of success that allow us to understand in our innovation what success is? And then we hold each of our innovations to that along the lines as an organization. And so that's sort of one way we think about measuring success. The challenge, though, and all of you who are entrepreneurs know this, is part of the way we measure success as well is kind of pivots. You know, how much are people learning about the system? How much are they learning about the market? Are they changing their business model? And if they're not changing at all, either it's magical and they just came on it the first time, which is almost unbelievable. But if they're changing and they're learning constantly, that's also a really important indicator of success and something that we track within Engineers Without Borders. So it gives you a bit of a sense of how we measure success as an organization. The challenge is really we're kind of going for big long-term change. And so part of the way we measure success is I can stand here in 10 years and say, yeah, rent-to-own is, and its copycats are operating in 25 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and EWB only ever has to put in $75,000 at the front end. And that, to me, would be really enormous success. Yeah?
I was curious, what's your structure, your nonprofit, and how are you funded that?
Yeah, so we're a charity. We're accepting donations all the time. So if you feel sort of the need to write a check tonight, feel free. I think I just turned this on. Yeah, so we're a charity, and we're pushing the boundaries of what a charity probably ought to be able to do, and I'm conscious that I'm standing in a legal office, potentially in front of lawyers. And the reason that I say that is because right now in Canada, the idea of charities working in something like social enterprises and running businesses, it happens. You have Goodwill. Goodwill is a charity. It runs a business. It runs these stores. But it's kind of operating in a bit of a gray zone. So to give an example, EWB has a 10% equity stake in Rent-To-Own as a charity. We made a $70,000 initial investment. We have made subsequent grants, which are charitable, but Rent-To-Own is a separate entity, which is for-profit, that's unlocking systemic innovation. Is that like operating in a legal gray zone? Absolutely. I think that it's sort of on the edge. But what we're doing is we're challenging, and I think this is something that's happening in Canada that's really exciting, is the boundaries between what is government, what is a nonprofit, and what is a for-profit. Those boundaries are getting really fuzzy. I would say in some ways, kind of legal structures and corporate structures are kind of trailing the innovation that's happening in some of that. Yeah.
Your membership numbers are really impressive, and I think we went Waterloo around the same time. So at that time, I don't think there was social media. So
No.
I'm just curious as to how you got to it. Was it 40,000 members?
Supporters.
Or supporters?
Yeah.
And how did you build chapters across the country?
It's a good question. I would say the answer is going to be surprising. It's not social media. It's giving a value proposition that was absolutely unique to people at a ground level in universities and engineers around the country. And that unique value proposition I would put in two ways. One is you're an engineer and we're not going to typecast you. And we're going to give you the opportunity to express your social and human values, which sounds strange, but was a unique value proposition. And two, we're going to create an organization that's going to give you, if you're a volunteer, more responsibility to own and drive the direction of the organization than you can imagine, and that's going to happen from day one. So when you show up at EWB on day one, somebody doesn't say, we really need you to do this. They say, what are your dreams and what do you think you can do through EWB that will allow you to create something great? And that's a really interesting value proposition for Gen Ys, I would say. Millennials, I think it's a really interesting value proposition for anybody who wants to create social change. And effectively what we've become is kind of this organization / movement / platform for people's dreams and ideas to go out there and create really interesting social value. And I think that that's just been attractive. And we've tried to figure out when we sort of operationalize this super messy and interesting organizational structure that allows that to happen, that allows an organization that basically has no rules and runs almost exclusively on culture and produces an enormous amount of value and still somehow stays unified and quite organized through that strong culture and those strong values. And so I think that's, it sounds like a strange answer to the question, but that's, I think, what's really allowed us to grow in that way and become sort of the organization that we are.
Great story. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for the talk. This is my first formal introduction to Engineers Without Borders.
Oh, great. Cool.
So I wanted to know first, is it only open to engineers and engineering students? Why did you pick the continent, Africa? And as an organization, is it that you have a mandate for certain problems that you're going to solve, or is that flexibility left to the actual, you didn't say that, you didn't say volunteer.
EWBer.
EWBer.
So, one, no. We have about 30% of the people involved in EWB are not engineers. And the reason is because while we think there's a particular opportunity to bring engineers and transform them into working on social issues, we think that they are much more powerful if they are working in teams with people from a broad variety of backgrounds and diverse backgrounds. And really what we do is we invite kind of anybody into EWB who's innovative and who wants to work on these issues in this way. And then we help them understand what it is to think like a systems changer. Somebody who can understand systems, understand those leverage points, and come up with really interesting ideas that address those leverage points. And so we build a lot of those capabilities and skills into almost anybody who comes. Second, why Africa? I get asked this a ton, and it's an important question. The question has two parts, one that is really satisfying to me and another that is not. So the one that is really satisfying and that logically fits is that when we look at global development and you look at issues around the world, the reality is most of the issues we're addressing are global in nature. If you look at something like rent-own, effectively what it's doing is it's addressing a broader global issue of inequitable distribution of finance and inequitable distribution of dollars. And you could go and you could walk 200 meters from here and probably find an entrepreneur in Toronto who also doesn't have access to affordable finance to grow their business. That is a global issue. What we've seen with Engineers Without Borders is that the biggest challenges and the most vulnerability to those global issues exists in sub-Saharan Africa, and in particular in rural sub-Saharan Africa. And you have an enormous amount of people who are extremely vulnerable and who are really affected by these systemic issues there. And so part of it is saying, listen, that's kind of there are these global issues, we need to address them in Canada, and the challenges of them are most felt in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's kind of the satisfying answer. The unsatisfying part of the answer is that in some ways it's a bit arbitrary, right? It's where we started to build our capabilities as an organization when we started, where we started to build our knowledge, where we started to build relationships, where when we started as an organization, we were in some ways quite unique in that we were challenging what I would call a kind of a traditional semi-neo-colonialist relationship between people who go and volunteer in Africa and people in Africa, which is kind of this white savior type of mentality. And we kind of challenge that, where we put people in to try and forge real partnership. And we were very successful at it, and bringing people in that way and forging these really interesting, authentic relationships. And so, and that's where we started, and so that's where we continue, and have been able to kind of craft a mission that is coherent with that. So that's a bit of that answer. And your third question was?
Is there a mandate for the problem?
Mandate, right, yeah. So we have 4 portfolios right now. We're in the process of actually trying to find 2 portfolios of emphasis. I can't tell you what those are because I will be able to tell you what they are in a week. We are in a process of whittling those down. But those are really areas of emphasis where we think they are systems or particular domains that we think have the opportunity that are kind of ripe for change. There's money, there's interest, there are ideas there are organizations and scaling mechanisms. And so those will be where we put our emphasis. But the reality is we're interested in any global issue that affects justice, and in particular can affect people disproportionately in sub-Saharan Africa, and in which there can be a really interesting innovation or systemic innovation. So we'll have our portfolios of emphasis, and then we'll look for great ideas wherever they are, and hopefully many of them are within those emphasis areas, and I'm sure a few will be outside of those. That's it. Thanks for having me. It's great being here.